One day my mother took my older sister, well, I have an older sister, Barb, 4 years older, and an older brother, Jerry, who was 8 years older. And one day Barb wanted to go into New York, so Mother drove Barb to the station in Orange, New Jersey, so Barb could take the train to Hoboken and get into New York. While we're doing this, the train comes out from Hoboken, and a lady gets off the train. And my mother said to me, I'm 10 years old in this memory, "Who does that lady look like to you?" And I said, "Well, she looks like our laundress." And Mother burst out laughing and said, "That is Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the President of the United States." Well, another thing about Llewellyn Park, everybody knew everybody. It was like a big club. Everyone who lived in the park knew everybody else. And my mother knew that Mrs. Roosevelt was a friend of a woman who lived in Llewellyn Park called Mrs. Parrish. And my mother was not particularly assertive, but she went up to Mrs. Roosevelt and introduced herself and said, "I'm Gertrude Franks, and I live in Llewellyn Park, and there's gas rationing, and I'm driving, my daughter and I are going back to the park now, and I was thinking, were you to be going to have lunch with Mrs. Parrish, could I offer you a ride?" And Mrs. Roosevelt, "Fine, perfectly fine." Mother said to me, "Get in the back seat." I pop in the back seat, and Mrs. Roosevelt gets in the front seat. And I mean, Mother and I didn't think that much about it. I mean, she had a very interesting conversation with Mrs. Roosevelt. And even though I was 10, when Mrs. Roosevelt kept talking about Winnie, I knew she was talking about Winston Churchill. Even though you didn't have a television, you knew who Winston Churchill was. So, I mean, can you imagine Michelle Obama getting off a train alone and being given a ride by a complete stranger? I mean, it just shows you what a different world I grew up in.